when she screamed at me in front of the entire neighborhood. Her voice sliced the morning air like a blade. "Get out now." Karen, the HOA president, stood there trembling with fury, blonde hair catching the sunlight, eyes burning with something more than anger. I froze, not because of the words, but because they didn't make sense. My house wasn't even in her HOA. Why would she care so much about property she had zero authority over? For a split second, I thought I was just dealing with a power-hungry neighbor. I was dead wrong. What unfolded in the weeks that followed was darker than anything I could have imagined. And what she did to my wife will haunt me for the rest of my life. When Beth and I moved to Maplewood, it was supposed to be our clean break. I'm Marcus, 38 years old, HVAC technician, used to long shifts and busted compressors, used to fixing what's broken. My wife Beth, a nurse at the hospital, had been working nights and living under pressure that never let up. We'd both had enough of controlling neighborhoods and rigid HOA rules. So when we found a modest two-story on the edge of Maplewood's borders outside the HOA, we thought we'd found our peace. No fines, no committees, no power games. Freedom at last. Or so we thought. I should have noticed the first red flag sooner. We hadn't even finished unloading the moving truck when she appeared on our porch. It was like she had been watching from the window, waiting for the perfect moment. She looked like the image of suburban perfection designer athleisure, flawless smile, plate of cookies still warm. "Welcome to Maplewood. I'm Karen, the HOA president. We take care of all residents here. It's what makes our community so special." There was a tone to the way she said all that should have made me stop in my tracks. I laughed it off, told her politely, "Actually, our house is outside HOA jurisdiction. That's one of the reasons we chose it." Her smile froze for just a fraction of a second. A twitch in the eye, a flicker of rage that she pulled back under control so fast I almost thought I imagined it. "Outside? That can't be right. Every house in Maplewood follows our standards." It wasn't a question. It was a correction, like she was fixing a mistake in the laws of the universe. For the next 40 minutes, what should have been neighborly small talk turned into an interrogation. Where did we buy? Who was our realtor? What were our jobs, our schedules? Did we have children? What were our long-term plans? Every question was wrapped in sugar-coated friendliness, but there was calculation behind her eyes. She wasn't welcoming us. She was building a dossier. She ran her hand along our door handle under the excuse of steadying herself, peeked through the windows while admiring our interior, even lingered at the electric meter outside. I thought she was just nosy. Later I'd realized she was cataloging our vulnerabilities. Before leaving, she leaned in with that same frozen smile. "Regardless of what the paperwork says, you're part of our community now. We protect our own here." The word protect sounded like a promise, but carried the weight of a threat. That night, as Beth and I unpacked boxes, I checked the mailbox and found something that made my blood run cold. A property survey we hadn't ordered. According to it, our house was inside Maplewood's HOA boundaries. It looked official: stamps, signatures, measurements, but it contradicted every document we signed at closing. Who had the power to create something like this? And why would they? The next morning there were fresh scratches around our deadbolts, the kind you only see when someone practices with luck. I wanted to believe it was coincidence, but the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. Days later, another neighbor introduced himself. Tom, late 50s, silver hair, the kind of handshake that demanded trust. "Retired county property assessor," he said proudly, as if it was a badge. And without preamble, he launched into a lecture on the benefits of HOA membership. He had charts, spreadsheets, graphs, stamped documents that made it look like joining would boost our property value 20%. Something about it was too polished, too ready. He even suggested refinancing with a broker who specialized in HOA properties. A perfect setup. He had answers to questions I hadn't even asked. And then it hit me: how did he even know I'd spoken with Karen? Unless someone had been listening. Unless this wasn't coincidence. Meanwhile, Karen's tone shifted. Gone were the cookies and polite smiles. Now she appeared at random, standing too close, speaking in that voice that sounded supportive but dripped with control. "Marcus, you're making this harder than it needs to be." Others who resisted faced permit delays, code violations, even police calls. Such a shame when families refuse to cooperate. Soon enough, official-looking violation letters began arriving. Lawn too long, mailbox improperly placed, unauthorized fence, each with detailed city code references, letterheads, fine schedules. They looked real, but when I called the city clerk, she told me flat out, "Sir, these entries were filed from inside our system. They don't exist on your property. Whoever did this had administrative access." That was the moment I knew. Karen and Tom weren't nosy neighbors. They had reached inside government systems, and they wanted us gone. I did what any desperate homeowner would do. I hired an attorney. Lena Carter, professional, sharp suit, kind eyes. She listened to my story, leaned in and said, "I see this all the time. Harassment disguised as authority. Don't worry, Marcus, I'll shut her down for the first time." I felt hope. She asked for everything: our mortgage papers, bank statements, schedules, even Beth's work records. She said it would build a comprehensive case. I trusted her. That was my mistake. because a week later I drove past a building downtown and saw something that stopped me cold. Through the glass, in a conference room, Lena sat at the table. Across from her was Karen. Between them, my mortgage file, my bank records. Lena wasn't defending us. She was feeding our secrets to the enemy. When I told Beth, she looked at me with a dazed confusion. Marcus, maybe you're being paranoid. Maybe Karen isn't that bad. My stomach dropped. This wasn't Beth. She was the strongest woman I knew, and yet, lately she'd been forgetting things, snapping over little details, doubting me in ways that didn't make sense. Then I saw it with my own eyes on the security camera. Karen at our kitchen table, pouring coffee. While Beth took a phone call, Karen tilted a vial and let a few drops slide into the cup. A practiced move, too smooth to be her first time. I had the cup tested at an independent lab. The results came back sedatives. The drugs explained Beth's mood swings, her memory lapses, her sudden doubt. Karen was poisoning my wife. When I confronted Beth with the evidence, tears filled her eyes. I thought I was losing my mind. I thought maybe you were right and I was paranoid. She was drugging me. With Beth back on my side, we dug deeper, and what we uncovered was bigger than anything I imagined. Karen wasn't acting alone. She had a network. Tom, the assessor, Lena, the lawyer, a doctor prescribing medications that compounded the sedatives, a therapist specializing in adjustment disorders, a building inspector filing fake reports, a zoning clerk with access to official systems, a conspiracy stretching through the veins of the city. They weren't after us because of a fence or a lawn. They targeted families like ours, inheritances, grief-stricken, distracted by life. They had done it to 12 other families, stealing properties worth nearly $2 million. The harassment escalated to violence. One morning, I found dead rats scattered across our lawn, spelling out the words, "Last warning." And then came the threat that shook me to my core. An anonymous call, calm voice, professional tone. "Stop digging, Marcus, or your wife's accident at the hospital won't be so accidental." We needed allies. That's when David Martinez called. His family had been through the same nightmare. His wife drugged, his property stolen. He had been gathering evidence for 2 years. He connected us with others. Suddenly, we weren't one family under siege. We were 5 families with the same story, and we were ready to fight back. We started documenting everything, every forged letter, every violation notice, every strange encounter. I mounted additional security cameras, placed hidden recorders near the mailbox, and kept duplicate files off-site in case anything happened to our house. It wasn't just about protecting ourselves anymore. It was about building a case strong enough to bring the whole operation down. David connected us with 3 more families, each with their own story that sounded eerily familiar. A widow pressured into selling her late husband's home after endless safety inspections that drained her savings. A young couple forced into refinancing with an HOA-approved broker who bled them dry. A retired veteran who found his wife's medication swapped for sedatives until he signed over a parcel of land. Different circumstances, same fingerprints, Karen's fingerprints. Every pattern we uncovered made it clear this wasn't random harassment, it was a systematic playbook refined over years. Step 1, befriend or intimidate new residents. Step 2, manufacture legal problems through fake violations or corrupted records. Step 3, undermine trust inside the family with drugs, counseling, or false narratives. Step 4, present a solution that always ended in the same result: loss of the property at a fraction of its value. Beth was still shaken by what Karen had done to her, but she refused to be a victim. She started keeping her own journal, recording subtle details that might otherwise have been missed. Mint taste in the coffee again today. Karen brought pastry, strange aftertaste. 3 hours of lost time at work. Her notes lined up perfectly with the lab results, proving this wasn't imagination. Tom's facade as the trustworthy neighbor began to crack. My cameras caught him prowling near our porch at night, snapping pictures through the window, even opening our mailbox with a key that shouldn't have existed. When confronted, he brushed it off with that disarming smile. "Just checking the neighborhood, Marcus. Old habits from my assessor days." But the footage told a different story, one of surveillance, not neighborly concern. Then came the night I saw Lena again. She called, insisting we meet to discuss a generous compromise. Out of curiosity, I went, careful to record everything. Her words dripped with false professionalism. "Marcus, there's no need for conflict. Karen has agreed to a property swap, a superior lot, plus a substantial cash payout. You and Beth could walk away with more than you ever dreamed of." Her offer sounded polished, legal, tempting even. But as she spoke, I remembered the vial in Karen's hand, the sedatives in Beth's system, the rats on our lawn. This wasn't generosity. It was the end game. And then Lena said something that froze my blood. Thinking her phone was muted, she turned and murmured, "Once the property transfer is complete, we can begin the Beth removal protocol." I walked out without a word, pulse hammering in my ears. They weren't just after the house. They had plans for my wife. The next morning, Beth sat at the kitchen table as I explained what I'd overheard. She went pale, then furious. "No more playing defense, Marcus. We're done waiting for them to make the next move. We hit back. Together with David and the others, we began planning, not just to survive but to expose Karen's entire network. The plan was simple, but it had to be flawless. We would lure Karen into thinking she was attending a reconciliation meeting, a community sit-down to smooth things over. She would never pass up the chance to grandstand in front of neighbors. But in reality, it would be an ambush of truth. Victim families, reporters, and state officials would all be there, ready to dismantle her empire in one night. We prepared for weeks. David compiled medical records from his wife's drugging. Another family gathered recordings of inspectors issuing fake citations. Beth typed up her own testimony, complete with the lab results proving she'd been poisoned. I collected every camera clip of Tom sneaking around our property and Lena exchanging files with Karen. All of it was duplicated, notarized, sealed in envelopes so no one could claim tampering the night before the meeting. I found a note on Beth's windshield. The brake lines of her car had been cut-sliced with professional precision, designed to fail during her morning commute. A paper scrap under the wipers read, "Some accidents are easier to believe." It was no longer harassment. It was attempted murder. I called the state police, bypassing the local department that Karen's allies had in their pocket. Detectives arrived before dawn, examined the sabotage, and placed Beth under protective watch. For the first time, outside authorities saw what we were facing. Karen still came to the meeting, walking in with the same fake smile, expecting to control the narrative like she always had. But her face changed when she saw cameras, when she saw state officials, when she saw the other families seated side by side, no longer isolated. For the first time, she wasn't in control. David spoke first, his voice steady as he laid out every tactic Karen had used to break his family apart. Then, another widow described the endless false inspections that drained her life savings. Beth held up the test results proving Karen had drugged her for weeks, her hand shaking but her voice sharp. The room grew heavier with every word. Then Tom stood. For years he had been Karen's right hand, the trusted assessor who validated her lies. But that night, he switched sides. He opened a thick folder and said, "I've been documenting Karen's crimes for 3 years." Gasps filled the room, and then he pressed play on a recording. Karen's voice poured from the speakers, cold and calculated. "These people are too stupid to know what's good for them. The drugging usually works within weeks, and if it doesn't, brake failure during a morning commute does the trick." The air in the community hall shifted. People who once smiled at Karen now stared at her with horror. Neighbors who had defended her turned pale. The perfect suburban leader was gone, replaced by a predator stripped bare. Karen tried to laugh it off, to claim the recordings were out of context, but the cracks were showing. Her voice shook, her hands trembled, and then, with cameras rolling and law enforcement watching, she snapped, "You don't understand," she screamed, pointing at me. "This neighborhood was perfect before you came. I controlled every lawn, every mailbox, every family decision, and you ruined it." Her face twisted, her eyes wild. "Get out now, get out now, get out now and restore my perfect community." The words echoed off the walls, her voice breaking into a shriek. Her knees buckled, her body trembling, the mask finally shattered. Officers moved in, placing her in handcuffs as she continued screaming like a child denied her toy. The moment was caught on every camera. The HOA president who once ruled with intimidation reduced to a wild, broken figure dragged out in disgrace. And for the first time since moving to Maplewood, I felt the weight lift from my chest. She was still screaming when the doors swung shut behind the officers and the sound drained into the hallway, leaving a thick, humming quiet in the room, the kind that makes you hear your own breathing. No one clapped. No one cheered. People just stared at one another like they were waking up from a trance and trying to remember when the dream had started. Beth's fingers were laced with mine, cool and steady, the way they are on long hospital nights when a monitor won't settle and she refuses to look away. Her eyes were clear again, no fog, no doubt, and for the first time since the cookies on our porch, we weren't standing alone. The work didn't end with the handcuffs. It began. Detectives stayed late, bagging drives and envelopes, taking sworn statements while camera crews packed up their lights. We signed our names so many times, the ink ran thin. Chain of custody, witness initials across tape seams, timestamps written twice, once on paper and once in the kind of memory that wakes you at 3 a.m. The state troopers assigned a contact who called me sir in a tone that meant business and left no room for the kind of casual dismissal we'd been fed for weeks. Beth's car went to an evidence bay. Our mailbox became a crime scene. Every forged letter got its own photograph. Every recording got mirrored to a clean device and sealed. By morning, the first stories had already hit airwaves, cut together with the worst of Karen's meltdown and the calm voices of people who had finally learned to say no. The words "get out now" ran as a chant, echoing across breakfast tables and office lobbies with the kind of power that only truth earns after hiding too long. Karen's attorneys tried to flood the zone, booked segments and fed statements about a devoted volunteer besieged by hysteria. Their press releases were written in a language of stability, civility, unfortunate misunderstandings, but the footage did not care for adjectives. It was a mirror, not an opinion. The legal counterpunch came just as fast. Civil filings landed like hail: defamation, interference, conspiracy. They were loud on purpose, designed to make us tired and poor. David had warned us. He'd lined up a legal clinic 3 towns over, lawyers who knew how to stack calendars, so we went in together. Affidavits harmonized, facts shared, travel split. We built summaries after each hearing, simple, ruthless paragraphs that anyone could read, then slid them under doors. Neighbors who had believed the flyers started knocking with questions, then with apologies. The man who had folded a newsletter into a square so crisp it could have been a flag brought us coffee, and said he didn't sleep well after seeing the mailbox clip. He stared at his own porch across the street like it had aged overnight. Tom didn't disappear. He sat down with investigators, then with a grand jury, not out of virtue but out of gravity. You can stay afloat in lies until the air runs thin. He brought logs and recordings and a ledger that didn't care who read it. There were retainer checks from a developer whose name had appeared and disappeared from zoning agendas like a tide table. There were memos from an attorney with neat margins and ugly ideas, a therapist who built sessions that looked identical except for the names at the top, an inspector who had saved template photos of fences an inch too high with file names like east_corner_generic.jpg. The doctor's prescription pad told its own story. Refills stacking in the exact windows when families became cooperative. Beth chose to speak for herself. In a bright room that smelled faintly of copy paper and coffee, she set down the lab results and her journal. She didn't cry. She didn't raise her voice. She said, "I am a nurse. I chart for a living. These are the mornings I lost." A prosecutor nodded, and the court reporter's fingers kept perfect time. There's a gravity to plain speech when it meets the weight of receipts. It doesn't need ornament. It just needs a table and a witness. The city government's response came in layers. First a frown, then a flurry, then a purge. The clerk who had granted the improper system access turned in a badge and keycard that afternoon. The inspector went on leave that became an exit. The zoning board member discovered conflict of interest policies he had previously described as theoretical. A task force with a name so serious it sounded federal set up shop in a windowless basement and started printing subpoenas. Local news ran a split screen for a week. Smiling, ribbon-cutting photos on the left, document screenshots on the right. Smiles wilted in the light. Neighbors began talking to one another like the sidewalks were finally safe again. People who had avoided eye contact gathered in driveways with coffee that steamed in the cool morning. The words "I'm sorry" traveled door to door with casseroles and shy smiles. You could measure the change by small things: how long a wave lasted, whether a garage door stayed open while someone tinkered with a bike, the way parents lingered at the curb without scanning for a clipboard. Karen's absence didn't fix us, but the truth created room for repair. There were days the spin almost worked. An op-ed with a picture of a picket fence asked whether neighborhood standards were being criminalized by outsiders who didn't understand community. The comments filled with people who wanted to believe that order could exist without abuse, that the line between care and control wasn't razor. We didn't argue online. We answered with filings: quiet, boring, devastating filings that stacked until the weight bent the shelf. The grand jury returned indictments in a clean, sober list that didn't shout and didn't need to. The bail hearing was the last time I saw Karen up close without a screen between us. She sat very straight in a gray suit, a shade too hopeful for the room, eyes searching for an angle to control. Her attorneys spoke of service, of misunderstandings, of regrettable language captured without context. The judge asked for the recordings. They played. The phrase "break failure" traveled farther than any apology could. When the judge finished writing, the paper sounded loud against the bench. Conditions, restrictions, a radius measured in miles and months. The air felt heavier when we stepped back into the hallway, like a storm had considered us and moved on. Restitution didn't arrive like a gift basket. It came in checks with decimals and memos, in liens liquidated and accounts clawed back, in a slow river of money returning to addresses it should never have left. Families stood on porches and opened envelopes they had stopped believing in. A widow called Beth and cried into the phone without words for a full minute before saying, "I can breathe again." David brought his kids to see the house he'd fixed instead of selling, and they ran their hands along the banister like it was a new animal learning its name. We stayed. People asked why, as if survival always requires a new zip code. We painted the front door the color Beth picked from a swatch book that looked like a deck of sunsets. I replaced the deadbolts with hardware that felt like the click of a good decision. We planted a strip of wildflowers along the mailbox: black-eyed, Susans and bee-balm, the kind of planting that doesn't obey straight edges or memos about uniformity. It grew as if the ground had been waiting for something that didn't require permission. A new board formed where the old one had ruled, smaller and quieter, with bylaws that read like invitations instead of weapons. Someone suggested a monthly potluck. Someone else said, "Let's start with a lending library of tools." And a week later, a neat little shed stood beside the community garden. Rules returned as suggestions, then as habits. It turns out people don't need a warden to mow a lawn or pick up after a dog. They need room to be decent and a neighbor who knows their kid's name. The last thing I did before putting away the boxes that had lived too long in the corner was tape a printout inside the hall closet. Not a manifesto, just a list we wrote at a kitchen table the night the fog lifted. Never meet alone. Record when lawful. Summarize the same night. Share facts, not fear. Paper beats rumor. People beat paper. It was not paranoia. It was posture. The way you stand makes it harder to push you over. Some afternoons I still hear it in the distance. That voice sharpened to a point. Get out now. It's different at the edges. Not a command anymore. A relic. Proof that controlled mistakes, volume for truth, and collapses when it meets a steady light. On those days, I walked the long way to the curb, past the flowers that bend without breaking, and I checked the mail just once. Inside are only the boring things of a normal life. A bill, a coupon, a letter from a cousin who finally wants to visit the lake. I open the door and call to Beth without thinking, and she answers from the kitchen, and the sound lands exactly where it should. If you've ever trusted someone who used your trust as a scaffold for their lies, I want you to know there's a way through. It isn't quick. It isn't pretty. It's receipts and witnesses and choosing not to flinch while the room tries to make you smaller. But there is a morning when the light finds the right angle and the mask cannot keep its shape. I have seen it. I have filmed it. I have signed my name across its seams. We didn't fix Maplewood. We let it fix itself after we hauled the weight off its chest. That's the secret no brochure prints. Real neighborhoods breathe. They don't march. They don't chant rules through gritted teeth. They pass a hammer hand to hand and build picnic tables without a committee. If this story found you because you are living a version of it, write down what happened today before sleep can blur the edges. Tell one person who believes you. Put your documents in 2 places. Practice saying no without